The dust swirled around Marcus Thompson's boots as he stepped out of his pickup truck, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly on his weathered face. At 42, Marcus had spent most of his life working construction jobs across the Southwest. But this particular project felt different. The state had hired his company to build a new water treatment facility on land that bordered the Tohono O'odham Nation, and tensions in the area had been running high for months. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead and surveyed the construction site. Heavy machinery sat idle in the afternoon heat, waiting for the cooler evening hours when work could resume safely. His crew had already called it a day, heading back to the nearby town of Sells for cold beers and air conditioning. But Marcus preferred to stay behind, checking equipment and planning the next day's work. He found peace in the silence of the desert, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote or the rustle of wind through the mesquite bushes. The project had been controversial from the start. Local residents worried about the impact on their water supply, while some tribal members viewed the construction as another encroachment on their ancestral lands. Marcus understood their concerns, even if he didn't always agree with the protests that had delayed construction for weeks. He was just a working man trying to make a living, not a politician or a developer looking to get rich off someone else's misfortune. As he walked around the perimeter of the site, checking the security fence and ensuring all equipment was properly secured, Marcus noticed movement in the distance. A figure was walking slowly across the desert floor, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had been traveling for a long time. The heat shimmer made it difficult to make out details, but Marcus could tell it was a person, not an animal. Curiosity got the better of him, and Marcus began walking toward the figure. As he got closer, he could see it was an elderly Native American man, probably in his 70s, wearing traditional clothing that looked dusty and worn from travel. The man's face was deeply lined, speaking of decades spent under the desert sun, and his long gray hair was tied back with a simple leather cord. He carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and his movements suggested he was exhausted. When Marcus was about 50 yards away, the old man noticed him and stopped walking. They stood looking at each other across the desert landscape, two strangers, separated by culture, age, and circumstance. Marcus raised his hand in greeting and continued walking forward slowly, not wanting to appear threatening. The old man waited, his dark eyes watching Marcus with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "You okay out here?" Marcus called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. The desert could be dangerous, especially for someone of the man's apparent age, and Marcus genuinely worried about his well-being. The old man nodded slowly but said nothing at first. His breathing was labored, and Marcus could see that his lips were cracked from dehydration. The traditional clothing, while appropriate for the culture, wasn't ideal for a long desert journey in the heat of the day. "My name is Marcus," he said, extending his hand in a gesture of friendship. "I work on the construction site over there. Are you lost? Do you need help?" The old man studied Marcus for a long moment before speaking. His voice was quiet but clear, with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English was not a first language. "I am Joseph Antone," he said, accepting Marcus's handshake with a firm grip despite his obvious fatigue. "I am not lost, but I am very thirsty." Marcus immediately felt a pang of guilt. Here he was, with access to clean water back at the construction site, talking to a man who was clearly suffering from dehydration. It didn't matter what their differences might be or what conflicts existed between the construction project and the local community. This was simply one human being in need of help from another. "Come with me," Marcus said, gently taking the old man's arm to support him. "I've got cold water back at the site, and you can rest in the shade of the trailer." Joseph allowed himself to be guided toward the construction site, his steps becoming slightly more steady as hope replaced desperation. Marcus talked quietly as they walked, explaining that he was the site foreman and that his crew had gone home for the day. He didn't want Joseph to worry about encountering a group of strangers or feeling overwhelmed. The walk back to the site took nearly 20 minutes, with Marcus adjusting his pace to match Joseph's tired movements. Several times they had to stop to rest, and Marcus used these moments to learn more about his unexpected visitor. Joseph explained that he was a spiritual leader in his community, someone the younger generation often came to for guidance and wisdom. He had been walking to visit a sacred site that his grandfather had shown him many decades ago, a place where his people had traditionally gone to pray and seek direction. When they finally reached the construction trailer, Marcus helped Joseph into the air-conditioned space and immediately got him a bottle of cold water from the small refrigerator he kept stocked for his crew. Joseph drank slowly and gratefully, his eyes closing with relief as the cool liquid soothed his parched throat. "This sacred place you're trying to reach," Marcus said, as Joseph finished his first bottle of water and accepted a second. "Is it far from here?" Joseph shook his head. "Not far now, maybe 2 miles toward those hills." He pointed in the direction he had been walking when Marcus first spotted him. "But I am older than I used to be, and the desert is less forgiving than it was in my youth." Marcus looked out the trailer window toward the hills Joseph had indicated. The terrain was rough and rocky, with several deep washes that could be dangerous to cross alone, especially for someone of Joseph's age. The idea of the old man continuing his journey without proper preparation troubled Marcus deeply. "Tell you what," Marcus said, making a decision that surprised him with its certainty. "Why don't you rest here tonight? I've got a cot in the back room and plenty of food and water. In the morning, when it's cooler, I can drive you to wherever you need to go." Joseph studied Marcus's face carefully, as if trying to read his true intentions. Trust didn't come easily when your people had been given promises that were later broken, but there was something in Marcus's manner that seemed genuine and without hidden motives. "You would do this for a stranger?" Joseph asked quietly. Marcus shrugged, suddenly feeling self-conscious about the gesture. "Seems like the right thing to do. Besides, my grandmother always said that helping others is how we help ourselves." For the first time since their meeting, Joseph smiled, and Marcus was struck by how much younger and more vibrant the old man looked when he wasn't suffering from exhaustion and dehydration. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the desert sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Marcus and Joseph sat outside the construction trailer sharing a simple dinner. Marcus had heated up 2 cans of beef stew on the small camping stove he kept for occasions when he worked late, and Joseph had contributed some traditional fry bread from his travel bundle. The contrast between their backgrounds seemed to dissolve in the peaceful evening air. Joseph proved to be an excellent storyteller, and as they ate, he shared tales of his childhood on the reservation, his years serving in the Vietnam War, and his eventual return to become a respected elder in his community. Marcus found himself fascinated by Joseph's perspective on the land around them, learning about plants and animals he had walked past countless times without really seeing. "This desert speaks to those who know how to listen," Joseph said, gesturing toward the vast landscape that stretched out before them. "Your machines are loud, but they cannot drown out the voice of the earth for those who have ears to hear." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. He had always loved the desert, but he realized his appreciation was largely aesthetic. Joseph's connection to the land was deeper, more spiritual, rooted in generations of his ancestors who had lived and died in harmony with this harsh but beautiful environment. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they finished their meal. "The protests about our construction project, I know a lot of people are angry about it. What's your take on the whole situation?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he considered his response. "Anger is like a flash flood in the desert," he finally said. "It comes quickly and destroys much, but it also passes quickly if you know how to wait for it. The real question is what remains when the anger is gone." "And what do you think remains?" Marcus asked. "People who must find a way to live together on the same land," Joseph replied simply. "Your water treatment plant will be built whether my people protest or not. The government has made its decision, but how it affects our community, how your workers and our families treat each other, how the land is cared for during and after construction, these things are not decided by politicians in distant offices." Marcus felt a weight settling on his shoulders as he absorbed Joseph's words. He had been thinking of his job in simple terms: follow the blueprints, meet the deadlines, collect his paycheck, and move on to the next project. But Joseph was right that the human impact would extend far beyond the completion of construction. "I try to run a respectful operation," Marcus said, "but I'm not sure that's enough." Joseph studied Marcus's face in the flickering light from the camping lantern they had set up on the small table between them. "Respect is always enough when it is genuine," he said. "The problem comes when respect is only words without actions to support them." As the evening grew cooler, Joseph excused himself to perform what he called his evening prayers. Marcus watched respectfully from a distance as the old man faced toward the hills and spoke quietly in his native language, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. There was something profoundly moving about the ritual, and Marcus found himself thinking about his own relationship with faith and tradition. When Joseph returned, he seemed more energized, as if the prayer had renewed his strength. "Tomorrow, I will complete my journey," he announced, "and you have been part of making that possible. This creates a connection between us that goes beyond our first meeting." "What kind of connection?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about Joseph's meaning. "In our tradition, when someone helps another person reach a sacred place, they become part of that person's spiritual journey. The prayers I offer tomorrow will include gratitude for your kindness, and that gratitude will be carried by the wind to the four directions." Marcus felt unexpectedly moved by this explanation. He had grown up in a family that attended church sporadically, but he had never experienced the kind of direct, personal spirituality that Joseph described so naturally. They talked late into the night, sharing stories about their families, their hopes, their disappointments, and their dreams. Marcus learned that Joseph had 3 grown children and 8 grandchildren, most of whom lived on or near the reservation. Joseph learned that Marcus had been married once but divorced, and that his main regret was not having children of his own. "It is not too late," Joseph told him. "A man who shows kindness to strangers will attract a woman who values kindness, and there are many children in the world who need father figures, even if they are not born to you." When they finally prepared for sleep, Joseph insisted on taking the sleeping bag Marcus had offered and sleeping outside under the stars. "I am more comfortable under the sky," he explained, "and I want to listen for the voices of my ancestors, who may visit me in dreams tonight." Marcus made sure Joseph had everything he needed, then retired to the trailer's back room. But sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake thinking about their conversation, about the construction project, about his own life and the choices he had made. Something about meeting Joseph felt significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate, as if their encounter was meant to be more than just a chance meeting in the desert. Several times during the night, Marcus heard Joseph talking quietly outside, though he couldn't make out the words. He assumed the old man was praying again, or perhaps talking to himself as elderly people sometimes did. It wasn't until much later that Marcus would learn Joseph had been speaking with visitors who had come to check on his well-being. Just before dawn, Marcus was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching the construction site. This was unusual, since his crew wasn't scheduled to arrive for another 2 hours, and they typically came in pickup trucks rather than the larger vehicles he was hearing. He got dressed quickly and stepped outside to investigate. What he saw made him freeze in surprise. At least a dozen cars and trucks were parked around the perimeter of the construction site, and people were emerging from them in small groups. All appeared to be Native Americans, ranging from teenagers to elderly adults, and they were all looking toward the trailer where Joseph was now sitting up in his sleeping bag, apparently unsurprised by their arrival. Marcus felt a momentary surge of panic, wondering if he had somehow walked into a planned protest or confrontation. But the people approaching didn't seem angry or threatening. Instead, they moved with the quiet respect of visitors coming to pay their respects to someone important. Joseph stood up slowly, brushing dust from his traditional clothing, and began walking toward the approaching groups. Marcus hung back, unsure whether he should retreat into the trailer or stay to see what would happen. His uncertainty lasted only a moment before Joseph turned and beckoned for him to come forward. "Marcus," Joseph called out, his voice carrying easily in the still morning air. "Come and meet my family. They have come to escort me to the sacred place, and they want to thank the man who showed kindness to their elder." Marcus walked toward the gathered crowd with his heart pounding, unsure of what to expect. As he got closer, he could see that the people were arranged in informal family groups, with children staying close to their parents and elders positioned, where they could see and be seen clearly. The atmosphere was solemn but not unfriendly, and Marcus began to relax slightly as he noticed several people nodding respectfully in his direction. Joseph reached the first group and immediately embraced a middle-aged woman who was clearly his daughter. She had his same intelligent eyes and dignified bearing, though her clothing was modern rather than traditional. Behind her stood a man about Marcus's age, along with 3 children ranging from perhaps 8 to 16 years old. "This is my daughter Sarah," Joseph said, introducing Marcus to the woman. "She teaches at the tribal college, and she was very worried when I didn't return home yesterday evening." Sarah stepped forward and extended her hand to Marcus with a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, my father called me last night to tell me about your kindness. Our family is very grateful that you helped him when he needed it most." Marcus shook her hand, surprised by the strength of her grip and the directness of her gaze. "Your father called you? I don't remember seeing him use a phone." Sarah laughed, a sound that reminded Marcus of wind chimes. "He borrowed your construction site phone while you were sleeping. He wanted us to know he was safe and to ask us to come early this morning to meet you before taking him to complete his journey." Marcus looked around at the growing crowd of people and vehicles, beginning to understand that this gathering was far larger and more organized than he had initially realized. "How many people are here?" he asked. "About 60, I think," Sarah replied. Word traveled quickly through the community last night. When people heard that a construction foreman had shown respect and kindness to one of our elders, many wanted to come and see for themselves. Joseph was now moving through the crowd, greeting people warmly and speaking in both English and what Marcus assumed was the Tohono O'odham language. Marcus noticed that many of the conversations seemed to involve gestures toward him, and he began to feel self-conscious about being the center of so much attention. A young man in his 20s approached Marcus with a confident stride and an outstretched hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm David Antone, Joseph's grandson. I want you to know that what you did yesterday means more to our family and our community than you probably realize." Marcus shook David's hand, noting the calluses that suggested physical work. "It wasn't a big deal," he said. "Anyone would have done the same thing." David's expression became serious. "Actually, that's not true. 3 other people saw my grandfather walking in the desert yesterday before you found him. None of them stopped to help." This information hit Marcus like a physical blow. The thought that Joseph might have continued suffering, or worse, if Marcus had decided to leave the construction site earlier, made him feel sick. Other people saw him and didn't help? 2 were tribal police officers who were responding to a call about vandalism at the water treatment site, David explained. They were in a hurry and assumed he was just out for a walk. The 3rd was a rancher from town who thought he might be trespassing and didn't want to get involved. Sarah rejoined the conversation, having finished her greetings with other family members. "This is why your actions stand out so clearly," she told Marcus. "You had no obligation to help a stranger, especially given the tensions between your project and our community. But you saw a human being in need and responded with your heart instead of your fears." Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing expressions of genuine warmth and gratitude. These were the same people whose community had been protesting his construction project for months, yet they were treating him like an honored guest rather than an enemy. "I have to admit," Marcus said carefully, "I'm a little overwhelmed by all this. Yesterday I just shared some water with your grandfather. Today it feels like I've accidentally become part of something much bigger." An elderly woman who had been standing quietly nearby stepped forward. She was probably in her 80s, with silver hair braided down her back and turquoise jewelry that caught the early morning sunlight. When she spoke, her voice commanded immediate respect from everyone within hearing. "Young man," she said to Marcus, "yesterday you became part of something bigger the moment you decided to see my nephew as a human being, rather than as a problem to be avoided. Today we are simply acknowledging what already happened." Joseph appeared at Marcus's side, having completed his rounds of greetings. "Marcus, this is my Aunt Agnes. She is one of our most respected elders and a keeper of our traditional stories. Agnes studied Marcus with eyes that seemed to see much more than he was comfortable revealing. Joseph tells me you asked good questions last night and listened carefully to his answers. This suggests wisdom beyond your years. I don't know about wisdom, Marcus replied honestly. Mostly I was just curious. Your nephew is a fascinating man with incredible stories. Curiosity about others is the beginning of wisdom, Agnes said approvingly. And the willingness to share food and shelter with a stranger is the beginning of true strength. More people continued to arrive as word of the gathering spread, and Marcus found himself being introduced to what seemed like half the reservation. There were teachers and ranchers, veterans and students, traditional artisans and modern professionals. Each person took time to thank him personally, and many shared brief stories about Joseph's importance in their lives. A teenage girl named Maria approached Marcus with a notebook in her hands. Mr. Thompson, I'm writing an article about this for our tribal newspaper. Can I ask you what made you decide to help my great-grandfather yesterday? Marcus thought about her question seriously, wanting to give an honest answer. I guess I saw someone who needed help and I had the ability to provide it. It seemed like the natural thing to do. But a lot of people don't see it as natural, Maria pointed out. Especially when there's conflict between communities. What do you think made the difference for you? Marcus considered this, aware that many people were listening to his response. Maybe it's because I've been helped by strangers at difficult times in my own life. I know what it feels like to be vulnerable and grateful when someone extends kindness without expecting anything in return. Agnes nodded approvingly at this answer. This man understands that we are all walking the same desert, she announced, to the crowd. Some days we have water to share, and some days we need someone else to share with us. As the morning progressed, Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Several people mentioned that this was the largest spontaneous gathering of community members in recent memory, and that it had been organized entirely through phone calls and word of mouth in less than 12 hours. Joseph eventually called for everyone's attention, speaking first in his native language and then switching to English for Marcus's benefit. My family and friends, we came here this morning to honor the kindness of a stranger who helped me when I needed help most. But I think we have also come to remind ourselves of who we are as a people and what we value most deeply. The crowd listened intently as Joseph continued. This man works on a project that many of us have opposed. Yet when he found me suffering in the desert, he didn't see a protester or a problem. He saw a fellow human being who needed water and shelter. This is the kind of recognition we have always hoped to receive from those who come to work on our ancestral lands. Sarah stepped forward to address the crowd. I think we're all feeling the same thing this morning. We came here expecting to say thank you to Mr. Thompson, but we're leaving with a reminder of our own responsibilities to extend the same kind of recognition and kindness to others. As the formal gathering began to wind down, several smaller groups formed around Marcus, each with specific questions or requests. A group of tribal college students wanted to interview him for a research project about cross-cultural understanding. Local business owners expressed interest in potentially working with his construction company on future projects. Parents asked if he would be willing to speak to their children about the importance of helping others regardless of their background. Marcus found himself agreeing to requests he never would have imagined receiving just 24 hours earlier. The most significant came from Agnes, the respected elder who had spoken to him earlier. She approached him with a ceremonial bundle wrapped in colorful cloth. Marcus Thompson, she said formally, our community would like to invite you to participate in my nephew's ceremony at the sacred site today. If you accept, you will become the first non-native person in living memory to be included in this particular ritual. The entire crowd seemed to hold its breath as Marcus processed this unexpected honor. He looked around at the faces watching him, seeing expressions of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. This was clearly unprecedented territory for everyone involved. I'm deeply honored by the invitation, Marcus said carefully, but I want to make sure I understand what it means. I don't want to accidentally disrespect something sacred to your community. Joseph stepped forward to explain. The ceremony I will perform today is a prayer for guidance and wisdom in making difficult decisions. I plan to pray about the conflicts surrounding your construction project and ask for help in finding solutions that honor both progress and tradition. Your presence would represent the bridge we hope to build between our communities." Agnes nodded approvingly. "You showed respect for our elder when no one required you to do so. This suggests you would show equal respect for our spiritual practices." Marcus felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. Accepting the invitation would clearly be meaningful to the native community, but it would also represent a level of involvement in local affairs that went far beyond his role as construction foreman. He thought about his company's policies, his crew's likely reaction, and the potential complications that might arise from being seen as taking sides in a contentious situation. "What would my participation involve exactly?" he asked. Joseph smiled at the practicality of the question. "You would observe respectfully while I perform the traditional prayers. Then, if you feel comfortable, you would be invited to speak your own prayers or thoughts about finding peaceful solutions to the challenges our communities face." "And this would be acceptable to everyone here?" Marcus asked, looking around at the assembled crowd. David, Joseph's grandson, stepped forward to answer. "Mr. Thompson, there was some debate about this invitation when we discussed it early this morning, but the consensus was that your actions yesterday earned you the right to be included if you choose to accept." A middle-aged man whom Marcus hadn't met before raised his hand to speak. "I'm Robert Cruz, chairman of the Tribal Council," he said. "I want you to know that several council members are here this morning, and we unanimously support this invitation. We see it as an opportunity to model the kind of cooperation we hope to achieve in the future." Marcus looked at Joseph, whose weathered face showed patient understanding of the difficulty of his decision. "What do you think I should do?" Marcus asked him directly. "I think you should listen to the same voice that told you to help me yesterday," Joseph replied quietly. "That voice has not led you wrong so far." After a moment of internal struggle, Marcus nodded his acceptance. "I would be honored to participate in your ceremony," he said, and was surprised by the spontaneous applause that erupted from the crowd. The next hour was spent in preparation for the journey to the sacred site. Marcus learned that the location was about 3 miles into the hills, accessible only by hiking trails that had been used by Joseph's people for centuries. The terrain was challenging, especially in the growing heat of the day, but several community members had volunteered to help carry supplies and provide assistance to anyone who needed it. Marcus was struck by the level of organization that had emerged spontaneously from the morning's gathering. People had assigned themselves roles without any central authority directing their actions. Some had brought extra water and food for the hike. Others had medical supplies in case anyone was injured on the rough terrain. Still others had appointed themselves as guides for those unfamiliar with the trail. As they prepared to leave the construction site, Marcus realized he needed to call his crew and let them know he wouldn't be available for the normal workday. This meant explaining at least part of what had happened, and he wasn't sure how his workers would react to news that their foreman was participating in a Native American ceremony. He called his assistant foreman, Jake Martinez, who had been with the company for 8 years, and had always been reliable in difficult situations. "Jake, I need you to take charge of the site today," Marcus said. "Something unexpected has come up, and I'll be away until this afternoon." "Everything okay, boss?" Jake asked with concern in his voice. "You never miss work unless someone's dying." Marcus looked around at the people preparing for the hike and realized that Jake's assumption wasn't entirely wrong. Something had died yesterday when he found Joseph in the desert. His old assumptions about the people who lived in this area and their relationship to his work. What was being born this morning was more complex and harder to define. "Everything's fine," Marcus told Jake. "Actually, everything's better than fine. I'll explain when I get back, but for now just run the normal schedule and I'll catch up with you this afternoon." The hike to the sacred site took nearly 2 hours, with frequent stops to rest and accommodate the varying fitness levels of the participants. Marcus found himself walking with different groups as the procession naturally shifted and reformed along the trail. He learned more about the community's history, their current challenges, and their hopes for the future than he had absorbed in months of working in the area. One conversation particularly struck him. A young father named Michael was carrying his 4-year-old daughter on his shoulders when he began talking about the water treatment plant construction. "Most of us aren't against development," he explained. "We understand that growth is inevitable and that infrastructure improvements benefit everyone. What we've been fighting is the lack of consultation and respect in how these projects are planned and implemented." "What would respectful development look like?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious. "It would start with conversations like the one we're having now," Michael replied. "Instead of announcing plans and then defending them against protests, developers would begin by asking community members what they need and how proposed projects might affect their daily lives." When they finally reached the sacred site, Marcus was amazed by its natural beauty. The location was a natural amphitheater formed by red rock formations with a spring-fed pool at the center, surrounded by ancient petroglyphs carved into the stone walls. The acoustics were remarkable, allowing whispered conversations to be heard clearly across the space. Joseph asked everyone to sit in a circle around the pool while he prepared for the ceremony. Marcus found himself between Sarah and Agnes, feeling both honored and nervous about what would come next. The site's spiritual power was unmistakable, and he understood why it had drawn Joseph's people for generations. The ceremony began with Joseph lighting sage and offering prayers in his native language, while the aromatic smoke drifted across the circle of participants. Marcus watched respectfully, trying to understand the rhythm and meaning of the ancient ritual, even though he couldn't comprehend the words. The elder's voice echoed off the rock walls, creating a haunting harmony that seemed to connect the present moment with countless generations who had gathered in this same sacred space. As Joseph transitioned to English, his prayers became accessible to Marcus and the other non-native speakers in the group. He spoke of gratitude for the land that sustained his people, concern for the challenges facing both native and non-native communities in the region, and hope for wisdom in navigating the changes that progress inevitably brought. "Great Spirit," Joseph said, his weathered hands raised toward the sky. "We ask for guidance in building bridges between different peoples who must share the same earth and water. Help us see past our fears to recognize the humanity in those who seem different from ourselves." When Joseph finished his traditional prayers, he turned to Marcus with an encouraging nod. "Now, my friend, would you like to share your own thoughts with the spirits of this place?" Marcus felt his heart racing as dozens of eyes focused on him. He had never been particularly religious, and the idea of speaking prayers aloud in front of strangers made him deeply uncomfortable. But something about the sacred atmosphere and the trust these people had shown him gave him courage to try. Standing slowly, Marcus looked around the circle of faces watching him with patient expectation. "I'm not sure I know how to pray the way you do," he began honestly, "but I can share what's in my heart." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then continued with growing confidence. "Yesterday I was just a construction foreman focused on finishing a job and moving on to the next project. Today I understand that my work affects real people with deep connections to this land. I want to ask for wisdom in finding ways to build necessary infrastructure while honoring the heritage and concerns of the communities where I work." Agnes nodded approvingly as Marcus spoke, and several people murmured agreement with his words. Encouraged by their response, he continued, "I also want to thank Joseph and all of you for teaching me that kindness between strangers can create connections that go far beyond what we initially imagine. Yesterday I shared water with a thirsty man. Today I'm part of something that feels much larger and more important than I knew was possible." When Marcus finished speaking and sat back down, Joseph rose again and offered concluding prayers that seemed to weave together the different voices and perspectives that had been shared. The ceremony ended with a period of silent reflection that lasted several minutes, broken only by the sound of wind through the rock formations and the gentle bubbling of the sacred spring. As people began to stir and prepare for the return journey, several community members approached Marcus privately to share their thoughts about what had transpired. The conversations revealed the complexity of feelings surrounding his unexpected inclusion in their sacred ritual. "My grandfather would have been shocked to see a white construction worker participating in our ceremonies," admitted Thomas A., man in his 50s who worked as a tribal police officer. But he also would have approved of honoring someone who showed genuine respect for our elder. Times change, and maybe our traditions need to evolve too. Maria, the teenager writing for the tribal newspaper, had been taking notes throughout the ceremony. Mr. Thompson, do you think this experience will change how you approach your construction projects in the future? Marcus considered her question carefully before responding. I think it will change how I approach everything in the future. Understanding how deeply people are connected to the places where they live makes me realize that construction work is never just about buildings and infrastructure. We're always affecting communities and relationships in ways I never fully considered before. The hike back to the construction site was more relaxed than the morning journey, with people talking freely about their impressions of the ceremony and their hopes for improved relationships between the tribal community and outside contractors. Marcus found himself the center of numerous conversations about practical ways to implement more respectful development practices. Several tribal council members walked with him for portions of the return trip, discussing specific concerns about the water treatment plant project and potential solutions that might address community worries while allowing construction to proceed. These conversations were more productive than months of formal meetings and protests had been. The main issue has never been opposition to the facility itself, explained Robert Cruz, the tribal council chairman. Our concerns have been about environmental protection, employment opportunities for tribal members, and long-term maintenance responsibilities. If we can address these issues collaboratively, most community opposition would probably disappear. Marcus realized that his company and the state agencies involved in the project had been missing opportunities for cooperation by approaching the tribal community as obstacles to overcome rather than partners to include. What would it take to restart these conversations on a more positive foundation? He asked. Today would be a good beginning, Robert replied with a smile. You've demonstrated the kind of respect and genuine interest that makes real dialogue possible. If your company and the state agencies were willing to approach our concerns with the same openness you've shown, we could probably resolve most issues fairly quickly. When they finally returned to the construction site, Marcus was surprised to find his entire crew waiting for him, along with several state officials and his company's regional manager. Jake Martinez approached him with a mixture of concern and curiosity on his face. Boss, we've been getting phone calls all morning about you being involved in some kind of Native American ceremony, Jake said. The state environmental officer wants to talk to you, and your regional manager drove down from Phoenix. Everyone wants to know what's going on. Marcus looked around at the faces of his crew members, seeing expressions ranging from confusion to suspicion to genuine interest. These were good men who had worked with him for years, but most of them had limited experience with Native American communities and might not understand the significance of what had transpired. Give me a few minutes to talk with the officials, Marcus told Jake. Then I'll explain everything to the crew. And Jake, whatever you've heard, it's probably more positive than you think. As Marcus approached the group of officials, he recognized Tom Bradley, the state project manager who had been overseeing the water treatment plant construction. Tom's expression was unreadable, but his body language suggested he was prepared for a difficult conversation. Marcus, we need to talk, Tom said without preamble. I've been getting calls from the governor's office about reports that you participated in some kind of tribal ceremony this morning. People are asking whether this represents a change in the project's relationship with the Native community. Marcus realized that news of the morning's events had traveled much faster and farther than he had anticipated. In today's connected world, Maria's newspaper article had probably been posted online within hours, and social media had amplified the story beyond the local community. Tom, I think what happened today could actually be very good news for the project, Marcus said carefully. But let me introduce you to some people who can explain it better than I can. Joseph, who had been saying goodbye to various family members, approached the group of officials with several tribal council members. Marcus performed introductions, noting how the atmosphere shifted as people moved from defensive postures to genuine curiosity about each other's perspectives. Robert Cruz, the tribal council chairman, took the lead in explaining the morning's events to the state officials. Gentlemen, What happened today began with a simple act of kindness between two individuals, but it evolved into an opportunity for our communities to demonstrate the kind of cooperation we've been hoping to achieve all along. Tom Bradley listened intently as Robert outlined the tribal community's specific concerns about the water treatment project and their willingness to work collaboratively on solutions. Marcus could see the state project manager's relief as he realized that the morning's ceremony represented an opportunity for progress rather than a complication to manage. "Are you saying the tribal opposition to the project might be negotiable?" Tom asked hopefully. "We're saying that most of our opposition has been to the process, not the project itself," Robert clarified. "If we can address our environmental and employment concerns through genuine consultation, the community would likely support moving forward." Agnes, the respected elder, stepped forward to address the officials directly. "Young men," she said, with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, this construction worker showed respect for our elder when he had no obligation to do so. This suggests it is possible for outside agencies to work with our community in ways that honor both progress and tradition. Marcus watched as his regional manager, Dave Collins, absorbed the implications of what he was hearing. Dave was a practical businessman who understood that community opposition could delay projects for months or years, while community support could accelerate timelines and reduce costs significantly. "What would it take to formalize this cooperation?" Dave asked Robert directly. "A commitment to meaningful consultation on environmental protection measures, priority consideration for tribal members in hiring for construction jobs, and a formal agreement about long-term maintenance responsibilities," Robert replied. "These are all issues we've been trying to discuss through official channels for months." Tom Bradley pulled out his phone and began making notes as Robert spoke. "I can arrange for state environmental specialists to meet with your environmental committee next week, and I'm pretty sure we can modify the hiring requirements to give preference to local workers, including tribal members." As these conversations continued, Marcus became aware that his crew was watching from a distance, clearly confused about their foreman's sudden involvement in high-level policy discussions. He excused himself from the official negotiations and walked over to address his workers directly. "Guys, I know this morning has been confusing for everyone," Marcus began, gathering his crew around him. "Let me explain what happened and what it might mean for our work here." He told them about finding Joseph in the desert, their conversation through the evening, and the community gathering that had formed around their simple interaction. Marcus emphasized the human aspects of the story while explaining how it had evolved into an opportunity for improved cooperation between their construction company and the local community. "So what does this mean for us?" asked Pete Ramirez, one of Marcus's most experienced equipment operators. "It means we might have a chance to finish this project with community support instead of community opposition," Marcus replied. "And it means we need to be extra careful about showing respect for the people who live here while we work." Jake Martinez, who had been listening thoughtfully, raised a practical question. "Are we going to have tribal members working on our crew?" "Possibly," Marcus said. "And if we do, I expect everyone to treat new crew members with the same professionalism you'd show anyone else. We're all here to do good work and get paid fairly for it."